All right, so today we move on from our very long discussion of supervised machine learning to just briefly discuss some ideas in unsupervised learning. So when we talked about machine learning before, we described the basic supervised machine learning problem. We had a vector of features in a sample, and there was some unknown relationship between the sample X and some target variable Y, and we wanted to find our prediction for the value of Y. And in week one, we drew this something like this. So we had some data, representation of some data in the form of XY pairs. And we learned Y hat, which was some prediction for X. And then we can take our true values Y and our predictions Y hat and compute some loss function. We could use the loss function to then improve our model for some of the models. And then we could also use it to evaluate it. Now, what does this mean in unsupervised learning? In unsupervised learning, we still have a vector of features, but we no longer have any labels. So now we have something like this. Okay. So same kind of situation. We have a model. We have some input from some sample, but now every sample has just an X value. All of these samples now just X. Okay, so two major issues here. One issue is what goes here, right? So now that we're no longer predicting a label value, what are we even producing as the output of our system? And another important issue is what is the loss function that we use to evaluate the system? And how do we train the system? So if we don't have a true value and a predicted value to compare to, how can we even describe how well our system does or train it? So to answer this question, let's actually think about what are some aspects of data that we might want to learn. Okay, we said that in unsupervised learning, we're going to learn something about the underlying structure of the data. What kind of details about the data structure might we want to learn? Any ideas? Okay, let's imagine a few examples. Okay, so suppose I have some rows of data in a table about various animals. I have cat, I have dog, I have wolf, I have lion, I have chicken, I have hawk. Okay, so just some basic information about some animals. Okay, and I have these in a table. So I have the name of each animal, and I also have, some descriptive characteristics of each animal in a tabular format, just like other data we've looked at so far. So what if I wanted to somehow decide which of these samples of data were kind of similar to one another and group them? So what if I wanted to produce something like this? Okay, so here I have two groups of data, one group of kind of like undomesticated data, wild animals, and another group of domesticated animals. So this is an example of finding out something about the structure of the data. So here, the structure I'm looking for is kind of some sort of group identity. Now, is there some known in advance group identity? Do I have a label that says, okay, cat, dog, chicken belong to group 1, and hawk, lion, wolf belong to group 2. Okay. I don't have any such data, but I'm interested nonetheless in kind of figuring out maybe how to organize these samples in the feature space by clustering them into groups. So this is one kind of unsupervised learning called clustering. What else might I want to learn about this data? What other information about the structure can I learn? Okay, well, one other thing I might want to learn is maybe I want to learn a representation of the data. Okay. So for example, suppose for each of these I had maybe a vector with 100 features with information about all of these animals. And I want to learn a more compact representation of each of these. So perhaps I can do something like this, okay, where I have, let's say, a smaller dimensional feature space. Okay, so instead of maybe 100 dimensions, now I have 3 dimensions. And maybe I'll do dimensionality reduction, okay, where I represent each of these samples in this feature space. And now I have a kind of lower dimension representation of the data than I had before. Okay. And again, each of these samples is really, an entire vector of data, but I'm just representing it by, let's say, this index, which is the name of the animal. So I can do clustering. I can kind of take the data. I don't have any, predefined cluster IDs, but I can try to make some up. I can try to represent the data in a more compact way. What else could I do with this data? Well, one thing that I could try to do, which is kind of related to dimensionality reduction, is maybe I can learn a better feature representation of the data. So when I do dimensionality reduction, and I reduce each sample from, let's say, a vector of length 100 to a vector of length 3, I am learning a reduced version of the data. But it might also be interesting to learn versions of the data that have certain properties. For example, I might be interested in learning a representation of the data where, let's say, all the domesticated animals happen to be near to one another in this feature space. And all of the non-domesticated animals are far from one another. Right? And maybe all the birds are kind of close to each other in one aspect. The feline species are close to one another in another dimension of the feature space. So maybe I want to learn a different feature representation. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be in a reduced dimension, right? Just maybe I want to learn a representation that has better characteristics. So these are some examples of things we might want to try and learn from the structure of the data. So we're not learning any predefined label. And we're not going to kind of predict something, let's say, unknown about the data, but we're just trying to infer some characteristics about the structure that we can then use in a useful way. Let's do one more. Okay, so suppose I had this data and now I have one other sample, coffee. And I want to detect that this sample is very unlike all the other samples. This is an example of anomaly detection. So there are all kinds of interesting and useful things that I can learn about the structure of the data. Anomaly detection, by the way, is kind of related to density estimation, or estimating the kind of probability distribution of the data. Because in anomaly detection, I can then detect that this sample is unlikely to have come from the same distribution as the rest. But I digress. Okay, so we have all kinds of examples of interesting things that we can learn about the structure of the data. And let's see how we can start to learn some of these things using machine learning. So our first topic is going to be dimensionality reduction with principal component analysis, or PCA. Now, we mentioned dimensionality reduction here. We said we might take these samples, which are vectors of length 100, for example, and try to represent them as in smaller dimensions. Why might we want to reduce the dimensionality of the data? Why would I ever want to do such a thing? Okay, Michael says it's more efficient. What's more efficient? So maybe it's a more compact representation. I can have the data stored in a compressed format. What else could I do with reduced data? So many of the machine learning models we learned about don't do very well on high dimensional data. So if we have data in some reduced dimension, then perhaps we can use the reduced data as input to a machine learning model, and it might do better. That's one possibility. Also, high dimensional data we know is difficult to visualize. So maybe we can visualize data better if we have a smaller D representation of it. Okay, let's take an example data set. Suppose I have a data set that represents all of the students who are attending this lecture today. And I have two features. Feature one is hours spent reviewing ML course materials. And feature two is ML homework grades. So let's say average grade. Now, are these two features, do you think they're correlated or uncorrelated? So they're probably related. So let's imagine that students who spend time actually reviewing the course materials also have higher homework grades. So we can imagine some data that looks maybe something like this. Okay. So imagine that this represents some of the students in this class. Now, suppose I want to do some sort of dimensionality reduction. We know that one way we can, let's say, reduce the dimensionality of the data. Let me actually move this. One way we can reduce the dimensionality of the data is to just do feature selection. So maybe we can just use whichever feature is more informative about the data. Okay, so one way to do feature selection is to just use one feature. And if I do that, I'll get the following data. So if I do feature selection and I choose to keep feature X1, then I'll have just this data, so one-dimensional data. Or I can do feature selection and only keep feature X2. And then I'll have this representation of the data, again, in one dimension. So when we do feature selection and we just choose one feature or the other, and then throw out the other one, we end up with something like this. Now, is this the best possible representation of the data in one dimension? Are either of these the best possible representation of the data in one dimension? So these features are somewhat correlated, but they're not exactly correlated, right? So we have some additional information from, let's say, feature 2 that we don't get from feature 1, and vice versa. So if we use either of these features alone, right, we lose some information in the data. So we don't get lossless dimensionality reduction. Now, this was feature selection where we reduce the dimensionality using existing features. What if instead of just using existing features and selecting one and throwing out the other, we could create a new feature where this new feature is more informative than either of the existing features alone? So we're going to reduce the dimensionality with a new feature space. Okay, so we have this existing data. And when I say a new feature space, so what we're going to do is project the data onto a new coordinate system. So let's quickly describe the idea of projection. So imagine I have one vector that looks like this, okay, and another vector that looks like this. Okay. And I want to project this first vector, let's call it z, onto this other vector v. Okay. The projection of z onto v is a vector that points in the same direction as v, but is scaled, so it might be longer than v or shorter than v. And it has a property that the distance between this new vector, the projection, and the original vector is the smallest possible such distance, right? So this is the distance between z and its projection onto v. And what do I mean when I say it's the smallest possible such distance? Well, imagine we had, let's say, a different vector pointing in the direction of v, like this one. Okay. So the projection of z onto v has to point in the same direction of v. This one has a smaller distance or a longer distance between z and the projection. Okay, so this is a longer distance. What about this one? Is this longer or smaller distance than the projection? Okay. So the projection of z onto v has a property that it's a vector pointing in the direction of v, but has the smallest possible distance between z and the projection. Okay. So I'm going to just label that. Now, we know that this data is two-dimensional data. Every sample is represented by a vector. So even though we describe them as points, they can still be described, in vector format. So now imagine we're going to project this onto a new coordinate axis. So let's draw a new coordinate axis. I'm going to draw it with lines. Okay, so just like in the original, we'll have 2 dimensions. And let's think about where we should place our new feature axis. Okay, so if we place it here, and then we project the data onto this axis, we just get this again, right? So that's just the existing features. So we want a new coordinate space where we project the data onto it and get some new features that are somehow better features. So we'll talk in a minute about what I mean by better. But let's see if our intuition tells us anything. Okay, what if I put the new feature space here? So I put the origin of the new feature space right there. Do we get better features? Okay, so this just gives us the same features, but shifted, right? So now we have zero-centered coordinate space. I actually like the zero-centered coordinate space, but doesn't necessarily give us what we wanted here. So it's not enough to just shift it over in space, right? In order to get better features, we also need to maybe rotate this coordinate axis. What about this? Is this the best possible projection we could get? So what makes a feature space good for projecting the data onto it? Let's think about that for a minute. So what do we want out of the new feature space? Well, one thing we said is that we want to use this for dimensionality reduction. Okay. So suppose we want to do dimensionality reduction. We want to be able to reproduce the original data as closely as possible from the projected data in one dimension. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say we did dimensionality reduction using existing features. So suppose I had, no more feature x2, just feature x1. Okay. What would be the reconstruction error of this? Okay. So here's my original data. We can see that the reconstruction error would be me drawing a line between each of these points and the original data sample. Okay. So here, each of these lines shows the reconstruction error, which says, okay, if we project this data onto this axis, and then just use the projected data to represent the samples, how much error do we have? So we could take the sum of the square of all of these lines, and that is a squared reconstruction error. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay, so this was projected onto an existing feature space. So now suppose we want to have the projection that actually minimizes that reconstruction error. Does this projection minimize the reconstruction error? Okay, so to minimize the reconstruction error, we want the distance between each point and the new axis, let's say the new horizontal axis, to be minimized. So maybe I'll rotate this a little more. Okay. I think this looks pretty good. What do you think? Okay, so what do we want out of the new feature space? We want to minimize reconstruction error. Okay, so suppose I take this data and now I project it onto this feature space. I have this data point here. Okay, so do I have less reconstruction error than I did using the existing features? So I have less reconstruction error with, let's say, my new first dimension of the data. Another thing is that I also have maximized the variance of the data in new dimension. So let's say variance of the projected data. Okay. So here, if you look at the variance of the data along the projected dimension, right, it's pretty large compared to maybe a different projection. Right? If I would project the data onto this dimension instead, right? Let's say I would project the data there, the variance would be much smaller of the projected data. With this projection, let's see if I can get it back. Okay. With this projection, the variance of the projected data is maximized. And I'll leave you to think about this, but it's always going to be the case that the projection that minimizes a reconstruction error also maximizes the variance of the projected data. The way you could think of that is something like this. So imagine this line here as the variance of the data, which is fixed. So imagine that the square of this line, so this is, let's say, a sample, the squared magnitude of this is a variance, right? So this is a variance of the data, which is fixed. This line here is a reconstruction error. So if you take the squared magnitude of that, that'll be the reconstruction error. And then this line here is a projection. Again, the squared magnitude of that or let's say variance of the projection. Okay, so the squared magnitude of the projection line is the variance of the projection. So you can kind of see by the Pythagorean theorem, right? So the variance of data is fixed. Any projection that maximizes the variance will also, let's say, minimize that. So the projection we're looking for is the one that minimizes that reconstruction error, which also maximizes the variance of the projection. So you can kind of try and think about that and convince yourself of that. Why do we want to maximize the variance of the projected data? So that's exactly right. So this keeps more information. So what's informative about the data is the differences between different samples, right? If we end up with a projection where all of the samples are very compact, so they're all represented by the same value, then we don't really have any information. But if we have a lot of variance in the new representation, that means we're preserving what's different about different samples. Okay. So this is a basic idea behind dimensionality reduction with PCA. Instead of reducing dimensionality with using the existing features, which doesn't necessarily give us the best representation in lower dimension, here we're reducing the dimensionality by projecting onto a new feature space so that the reconstruction error for the projected data is minimized and the variance of the projected data is maximized. So let's talk about how to do that. Okay, so we mentioned the idea of a projection already. So if we have some vectors z and v, we can draw the projection of z onto v. And we said if you think of all the set of, let's say, vectors pointing in the direction of v but scaled by some alpha, so the projection of z onto v is the closest vector in that set to the original vector z. Okay. All right. This is just what we just did. So let's think about how we can actually calculate this projection, right? So I just found this projection by kind of hand waving, by drawing a new feature axis and moving it around until it seems to fit the data well and minimize reconstruction error and also maximize variance. Obviously, you can't do that by hand normally, especially for high dimensional data. So let's talk about how we maximize the average square distance to, okay, so let's actually look at this. So there's this nice animation I found online. Okay, so imagine you have this data. So this dot in the center of the data is the mean of the data. Okay. And we know that, let's say, the distance from each point on the projected line to the mean is its variance. Okay. So notice that when the line is kind of aligned with these magenta parts, the variance is maximized. Okay. Here you can see the variance is small. So the red points are not spread out around the point in the middle. When it's aligned perfectly, you can see the variance is large along this line. So that's a line that maximizes the variance of the projected data. Now, these red lines from the blue points to the projected point show the reconstruction error. So again, you can see that's a line that minimizes the reconstruction error. Okay, so these red lines are minimized when it's aligned with those magenta ticks. Okay, so how do we find that line? So we find that line by using the covariance matrix of the data. Okay. So we start actually by centering our data. So we're going to write the steps down here. Okay, the first step is going to be to center the data. Why do we center the data? Well, you can see here that it's actually very common to center and scale the data because you need the, let's say, the features to be informative, equally informative. So depending on what kind of data you have, right, it might actually be meaningful that the scales are very different, or it might not be very meaningful. If it is meaningful that the scales are different, let's say, if, let's say, the feature with a wider range is actually much more informative, then you would kind of keep that. But if that's not meaningful, you would scale the data. Okay, so we're going to center and possibly scale the data. And then step 2 is going to be to compute the covariance matrix of the data. Okay, what is a covariance matrix of the data? Well, suppose you have some data, let's say 2-dimensional data like this. So I have a feature x1 and I have a feature x2. So the covariance matrix is a P by P matrix, so a square matrix of the dimension of the data, where along the diagonal, I have the sample variance of each feature. So this box here is a sample variance of x1. This box here is a sample variance of x2. And then in the other entries in this matrix, I have the pairwise covariance of the features. So this box is, let's say, the covariance of x1 and x2. Right? So here's my covariance matrix. So I computed I centered the data and I computed the covariance matrix. Now, if you have centered data, you can actually compute the covariance matrix very easily by matrix multiplication. So if you have centered data, so mean removed data, which we'll denote as x tilde, then x tilde transpose times x is n times the covariance matrix. So it's an easy way to compute the covariance matrix. Okay, I have the covariance matrix. What's next? Now I am looking for some projections. Okay. And the projections I'm looking for are the ones that maximize what we'll call the directional variance. Okay. So the directional variance is the variance of the projection of a row of data onto some new vector. Okay, so if we have a projection onto V of, let's say, a mean removed row, so tilde xi, we'll call that zi. Now the sample mean is just, let's say, that vector times the mean of the data. And then the sample variance is, let's say, the covariance matrix times that vector. So if we have a projection of the data onto a vector, then we can compute the sample variance for the projection by multiplying the vector onto which we projected and the covariance matrix. Okay. By the way, these quantities here, we said when we project onto V, we end up with, let's say, a scaled version of V. So this is that scalar. This quantity, V transpose times x tilde, is a scalar that tells us, let's say, how far along V our projection is. Then this quantity is also a scalar, and this entire multiplication is also a scalar. Those are just sample variances and covariances. Okay, so we have this quantity directional variance, which we defined as the variance of the projected data. And now we want to know, given some data, what is the direction of the vector that we should choose in order to maximize the variance of the projection? So since we just defined the directional variance like this, we can say we want to maximize this directional variance. Okay. And we know that the magnitude of the vector onto which we project is not really very meaningful, right? Because when we do the projection, what's important is that it will point in the same direction as the vector onto which we project. But we separately compute the scale. So we're just going to say that the vector onto which we project should have unit norm. Okay. So we want to maximize this variance of the projection of the data onto some vector, subject to that the vector has unit norm. How do we solve this problem? Well, it turns out, and I'm not going to get into this, but if you've taken a linear algebra class, hopefully some of this will be familiar to you. So for a matrix Q, there is a set of special vectors known as eigenvectors. So these are, let's say, elements of the eigenvector. This is, let's say, E1, E2. So there's a set of special vectors called eigenvectors such that if you multiply the covariance matrix by the eigenvector, the result is actually just a scaled version of the eigenvector. So when you multiply the covariance matrix by the eigenvector, the result points in the same direction. And let's get a lambda symbol in here. Okay. And that scale is defined by a number which we'll call the eigenvalue. So the eigenvectors have the special property that if you multiply this matrix by its eigenvector, the result is going to be a scaled version of the same eigenvector. Okay, so this is an eigenvalue, and this quantity here is an eigenvector. Does anyone know, if I have a 2x2 matrix, how many eigenvectors are there? If I have a p by p matrix, it will have p eigenvectors, so as many as the dimensionality of the data. Okay. And I'm not going to get into how you find these eigenvectors. If you've taken linear algebra, you may remember that. But let's just take it at my word that they exist. So there are these special vectors that when you multiply the covariance matrix by the eigenvector, the result is a scaled version of the eigenvector. And this quantity, which is the eigenvalue, tells you how much longer or shorter the eigenvector gets when you multiply it with the covariance matrix. I'm also going to tell you, and just take it at my word, that a P by P matrix has P eigenvectors. So this 2 by 2 matrix will have 2 eigenvectors. And I'll also ask you to take it at my word that the eigenvectors are orthogonal. Okay, so this vector and this vector are orthogonal, which means if you multiply, let's say this times this transpose, or let's say this times this transpose, this multiplication is equal to 0. Okay, so that will actually be the next step in computing PCA. So we're going to compute the covariance matrix, then we're going to find eigenvectors and eigenvalues. Now, I'm not going to prove this either, okay? But it actually turns out that each of these eigenvectors is a vector that is a local maxima of this optimization problem. And if you remember what we did with constrained optimization when we talked about SVM, where we formed the Lagrangian and then set it equal to 0, you can actually prove yourself in a few lines that the Lagrangians, which will be the eigenvalues, that let's say every local maxima of this optimization problem is an eigenvector. How do we know? Because it has this property that if you multiply that V by the covariance matrix, the result is a scaled version of that. Okay, so we had this optimization problem. The solutions are all the local maxima of this are eigenvectors. And if you sort them in descending order of eigenvalue, so let's say this is the largest eigenvalue, this is the second largest eigenvalue, it turns out that the vector associated with the largest eigenvalue is the one that maximizes this directional variance. So the variance along the projected line. And then the second one, so the vector with the second highest eigenvalue, is the one with the second highest directional variance. So these eigenvectors and eigenvalues have this property, and you can prove this at home or you can look at the notes later, that the projection of the data onto the eigenvector maximizes the directional variance of the projection, where the directional variance is highest for the eigenvector with the largest eigenvalue. It's second highest for the projection onto the eigenvector with the second highest eigenvalue, and so on. And you can actually kind of see that here. So you can see here that the variance, the directional variance is maximized by the projection onto this line. And you can then see that this line here, which is orthogonal to the first line, because eigenvectors are orthogonal to one another. This is a line that's, let's say, is the second highest maximum directional variance if you project the data. So that's our next step. Our next step is going to be to sort by eigenvalue. Okay. And then we can represent the data by project data onto our eigenvectors. So now we have a representation of the data where the projection onto the first eigenvector is the one that carries the most information about the data, so maximizes the variance of the projected data. The projection onto the second eigenvector maximizes, let's say, the second highest maximum information in the data. And also note that the data is now, the projection of the data onto the eigenvectors is now uncorrelated, because the eigenvectors themselves are uncorrelated. So it has all these nice properties. Let's actually describe the projection a little more. So we're going to choose P prime highest eigenvalues. Project data onto these eigenvectors. Now we have n times P prime data. So now instead of representing the data in the original feature space, we can choose the P prime highest eigenvalues, take their associated eigenvectors, project the data onto those eigenvectors, and now we have data with a reduced dimension. Now, these steps are just kind of the way we like to think about doing PCA. In practice, when we compute PCA, we don't actually do it like this. We use singular value decomposition, but it will yield the same result. Okay, so we have this new data that's projected onto this line. So imagine I have this projection. So I have a projection onto this line. And I also have a projection onto this line. And this is now how I'm going to represent the data. So instead of representing it in the original feature space, I'm going to represent it according to this new dimension, x1 here, x2 here. Okay. So I have the data in the new dimension. Can I use the new dimension to reconstruct exactly the original data? Suppose I have the data in this new, let's call these x1 prime and x2 prime. Can I use this to, let's say, reconstruct the original samples? So I haven't actually lost any information. So I can then kind of undo the projection by, let's say, projecting by transpose, actually. And then I can reconstruct the original data. So I can project the data onto this new feature space, and then I can undo that linear projection to reproduce the data exactly. And then, again, add up all those projections. So if I have some data here, x tilde means mean removed data. And I have these vectors, let's say v1 to vp, where p is the dimensionality of the data. And we'll call these each the principal components of the data. So I can project xi onto each of these. And then I can actually reconstruct exactly the original data. So I haven't lost any information. Now suppose I want to consider the approximation with the first, let's say, d coefficients, or the first p prime coefficients. So instead of using all of the principal components, I'm going to represent it more compactly using maybe one principal component. Will I lose some data? Or can I represent the original data exactly? So suppose I only had the projection onto x1 prime. Can I represent the original data exactly? I no longer have these. If I do that, I lose some data, right? This is actually the real sample. So if I only have the projection onto x1, I lose some data. What if I only have the projection onto x2? Can I reproduce the original data exactly? So the projection onto x2 also loses some data. Which one loses more data? So we know that x1 is a projection that's most informative about x, right? It has these properties that it minimizes a reconstruction error of the original sample from the projected data. And it maximizes the variance of the projected data. So the projection onto the first principal component is always the most informative. Now, what about redundancy? Suppose I have higher dimensional projection. So maybe I have 3-dimensional data. So I have a projection onto a 3D feature space. Are those projections going to carry any redundant information? Okay, so suppose I had 3D data, and instead of projecting onto a 2D feature space, I projected onto a 3D feature space. Now this of course assumes that my data was 3D to begin with. Now, since the eigenvectors are orthogonal to one another, the projection of the data onto the eigenvectors is also orthogonal, which means that the data, once it's projected into the new space defined by the principal component analysis, is now uncorrelated. So this is actually a method of decorrelating data. So that's really powerful, actually, because that means that ordinarily, if you have higher dimensional data, when you, let's say, represent this data using two features, x1 and x2, you don't necessarily get the maximum new information by, let's say, adding x2 on top of x1, because x2 is correlated with x1. So there's some redundancy there. With PCA, there's no redundancy when you add a new projected feature, because each of the projected features are orthogonal to one another. And so you get the maximum information with no redundancy at all. So PCA is a way of projecting the data into a new feature space so that you can decide how many features you want, and you get the maximum information you could possibly get from the reduced feature space. Okay. And so the total average reconstruction error is going to be minimized. Okay. We can also say that you can, let's say, compress the data in such a way that you have your desired proportion of explained variance. Okay. So we know that 100% of variance of the data is explained by the projection onto all the principal components. So if you project the data with, let's say, D principal components, so D of these eigenvectors, the proportion of variance that's explained by the compressed data is the sum of the first D principal components over the sum of all principal components. Now we know the principal components are ordered in terms of their value. Okay, so we had, let's say, these. One, 2, 3. Let's go to. Okay. Suppose I represent data using these principal components or using just these principal components. Okay. If I represent the data using these principal components, let's say the eigenvector is associated with these eigenvalues, we know that this is the one that's most informative about the data. This is the one that's second most informative about the data. This is the one that's third most informative about the data, and so on. So if we represent data using the first principal components, the only information we lose is what's ever represented in the least informative representations. So these are the least informative projections. These are the most informative projections. So when we do PCA, we capture the most informative aspects of the data, and we kind of neglect the least informative aspects. So this is a dimensionality reduction that's much better than our, let's say, previous feature selection, where we would just use one or the other existing features, but not necessarily maximizing the information. With this projection onto a new feature space, we maximize the information in our reduced representation. Okay, that's all we're going to say about PCA. Are there any questions? I know it's a little math heavy, but I just really want you to get the intuition of it. Okay, there are no questions. Let's talk about our next unsupervised learning problem, which is clustering. Okay. So imagine you have a matrix of data. our goal here is to group the data into some number of clusters. Okay. So looking at this data, can you imagine how you might group it into clusters? It's kind of easy to look at this and say, like, okay, maybe I would make this one cluster, this another cluster, this another cluster, which is kind of easy to see in high dimensions and low dimensions, not easy at all to see in higher dimensions. Now, intuitively, we saw that there should be 3 clusters. Why? Why should there be 3 clusters and not, let's say, this as one cluster, this as another cluster, or so on? Okay. So it has to do with the distances between points. What we really want is to have, let's say, a label for each cluster. So maybe I'll draw a label here. Okay, maybe this is one group. This is another group. And this is another group. And the desirable property for clustering okay, so the distance between a point in the cluster and other points in the cluster should be small. Okay. And the distance between point in cluster and point in another cluster can be large. So when we talk about clustering, what we want is for the distance between one point in a cluster and all other points in a cluster to be as small as possible. We don't necessarily care about distance between points in a cluster and points in other clusters. So this is a desirable property for clustering. So we have some data. We want to group data into some number of clusters, and we're going to say that the number of clusters is defined in advance. So we want to assign, let's say, a cluster label to each sample. And we want to assign cluster labels such that the distance between samples in the same cluster is small. Okay, so how do we do this? Any ideas? How do we select clusters? Well, first, let's think about how we define each cluster. Okay. So here we defined each cluster by a box. But instead of a box, I'm going to instead define each cluster by, let's say, the mean of all the points in that cluster. Okay, so this is, let's say, the purple cluster, the green cluster, and this is a red cluster. Okay. And what we're looking for is to minimize the distance between a point in a cluster and the mean of that cluster. Okay, so for example, if all of these points are in the purple cluster, we want to minimize the distance from each of these points to the mean of the cluster. Okay. And then we want to do the same for each of the other clusters. So we want to minimize the squared sum of each of these distances. This is this optimization problem. So the inner sum is over, let's say, one specific cluster. So for every point in that cluster, we want to minimize the distance from the point to the mean of the cluster. And then the outer sum is over the entire cluster. Let's actually go back here for a moment. So we said at the beginning that one of the difficulties with unsupervised learning is you need to figure out what the output is going to be, and you also need to think about what the loss function is going to be. So with PCA, what was the output? With PCA, you could think of the output of the unsupervised learning algorithm as projected data. You can even say projected reduced data. So if we're doing dimensionality reduction with PCA, we're interested in the reduced data in a new feature space. What would be the loss function that we're minimizing with PCA? Okay, so we're minimizing the reconstruction error. Okay, and then training involves just those steps we described. And you can evaluate again using the reconstruction error. So this was PCA. Now we're doing clustering. Let's go back here. Okay, so for clustering, what is the output of the clustering algorithm? So the output of the clustering algorithm is for every point, we'll give it a cluster label and the mean of that cluster. Okay, so we define clusters by, let's say, their label and the mean. So the output will be a label for each point and the mean of the cluster. Okay, and what I'm showing now is a loss function. So this is the loss function we want to minimize. We want to minimize a square distance between points and cluster means. Now, how do we go about training this? So how do we go about actually finding the clusters and the cluster means? Okay, so let's start like this. We're going to start with some random guesses. I'm going to start by randomly placing 3 cluster means somewhere over here. Okay. So I randomly place some cluster means. Okay. My next step, let's write down the steps. This is called k-means algorithm for clustering. Step 1, okay, randomly place cluster means. Now I'm going to basically do a forward pass. So my next step is going to be to assign each point to a cluster. How should I assign each point to a cluster? Evan asks, how do we know the initial number of clusters? That's a very good question. Here we're assuming it's known, but there's a whole other class of unsupervised learning algorithms just for deciding how many clusters they have to begin with. Okay, so I randomly placed my cluster means. Now I need to assign each point to a cluster. How do I do that? Okay, let's use a nearest neighbor rule. So I'm going to assign each point to a cluster based on distance to cluster means. So here, for example, maybe I'll have these points all belong to the red cluster. Okay, maybe these points belong to the green cluster. these points will be assigned to the purple cluster. Okay, just by which cluster mean they're closest to. Okay, are these good clusters? Okay, they're not very good at all, but that's okay. Okay, so I randomly place a cluster mean. I assign each point to a cluster. My next step is going to be to update the position of the cluster means. Okay. So the cluster mean should be the mean value of all the points in that cluster. Okay, let's look at the purple cluster first. The purple cluster has 2 points kind of to the top left of it, and 6 points to the bottom right of it. What direction should I move the purple cluster mean in? Okay, let's move the purple cluster mean more towards here, because it's supposed to be the mean of all these points, right? So now I'm going to update the position of each cluster means. The green one, I think, is going to move slightly here. And let's say looking at the red points, I believe the red point is going to move farther in this direction. Okay. All right, what should I do next? Well, I just moved the cluster means, right? So now I need to repeat step 2, right? So once I move the cluster means, now I need to assign new cluster labels. Okay, so I move the cluster means. Now this point is now closer to the red cluster, so it's going to turn red. These points are definitely much closer to the green cluster now. This point's still in between. This one looks closer to red now. And this one will also be closer to red. Okay, so I'm going to repeat step 2. Now that I've moved the cluster means, I'm going to assign each point to its new cluster by nearest neighbor. Now I need to repeat step 3 because now I've changed the points associated with each cluster, so the mean should also change. Okay, so let's move the green one. The green one now moves way in this direction because most of its points are over here. The red one will move towards the points that are now associated with red. Put it here. The purple one still has some points all the way over here as they'll pull the mean over. So it's right here. All right, what should I do next? So I'm going to keep repeating this cycle, right, where, let's actually make this. Right. Anytime I assign points to cluster, so I assign points to different cluster, then the cluster mean changes. So then I need to update the position of the cluster means. Right. But every time I update the position of the cluster means, well, the nearest neighbor of each point also changes. Right. So then I need to reassign points to clusters. So this is a cycle I'm going to have to keep repeating, right? So I just moved these cluster means over. Let's see, now this green point is, this point is definitely much closer to the green sample now. This point is now definitely closer to red. Okay, let's move the cluster means again. Okay, this moved in this direction because I got rid of this point. This moves in this direction. All right, now we've updated the position of the cluster means. The nearest neighbor of some points have changed. Let's assign points to clusters. This one is now closest to the green cluster. And I think that's about it. Okay. Let's update the position of the cluster means. Maybe now it's here. All right. Now, when do I stop this process? Should I stop now? So I stop the process when, let's say, assigning points to a cluster no longer changes the position of the cluster means. Right? So now I've changed the position of the cluster means for the last time. Right? So I've updated the position of cluster means. Has the nearest neighbor of any points changed? Do I need to reassign any points to a different cluster? No. Okay, so I'm done. Okay, so now I'm ready to stop. So this is my training. Now, how do I evaluate whether I did a good job clustering? So I can evaluate using the same loss function, which is a squared distance between the points and the cluster means. But of course, that's not always going to be a good indication of how well I did clustering. And this algorithm is also pretty sensitive to initial conditions. Okay. So this is a very simple clustering algorithm. It's actually the only one we'll learn, but it's definitely pretty limited. So there's a lot more in unsupervised learning that we're just barely scratching the surface of. Okay, the reason we're only going to learn a very little bit of clustering is because I wanted to be able to talk about some deep learning approaches to unsupervised learning. Because just like with supervised learning, deep learning is where it's at. So let's talk about maybe a deep learning approach to some of the same problems. Okay. We're going to describe a type of system called an autoencoder. And an autoencoder is made up of two parts. Okay. On the one hand, we have an encoder. And then we'll also have a decoder. And here's what it does. So you take a sample X. Okay. The encoder produces a low dimensional representation. That's called Z. The decoder takes Z as input and produces some reconstruction. Okay, as close as I can get to X hat. Okay. So it's a system where I take some data, produce a low dimensional version of it, and then reconstruct it. Okay, we learned about PCA. Does PCA do this? Okay, so PCA does this, right? So one way to do this is to, take X, project it onto, let's say, the first D principal components, and then undo the projection to, let's say, reconstruct a version of X. But this is a compressed version of X. Okay. Z, by the way, is called, let's see, it might be called latent representation or latent variable. And it's a lower dimensional representation of the data. Okay, what about k-means? Can you use k-means for encoding and decoding data? So one way to do that is to actually do this clustering. And then for every data point, you just output its cluster mean, right? So I can actually use k-means for dimensionality reduction too. Let's say, take some data point as input. The latent representation is just going to be the cluster mean. And then that's going to be my kind of compressed version of the data. So I can use k-means as an autoencoder. I can use PCA as an autoencoder. Now, what's the disadvantage of using PCA as an autoencoder? One limitation of PCA is that it will only kind of learn linear projections. Let's go back to PCA. So PCA learns some reduced data by creating a linear projection onto a new feature space. But we know from our discussion of neural networks that you can sometimes learn much more powerful features by, where's my autoencoder? You can sometimes learn much more powerful features with a nonlinear representation of the data. Okay. So another way to implement an autoencoder is with a neural network. So a neural autoencoder would look something like this. Okay, you have some input data, which is high dimensional. Okay. And you feed it into a neural network. And the neural network will maybe produce a smaller representation of the data internally. I'm not going to draw all the edges, but you get that they're there. So here there's a smaller representation internally, because you might have many inputs to the network, but in the middle of the network, you might have this kind of bottleneck where you have a small number of neurons in the middle. And then at the output, your output layer will be the same dimension as the input. Okay. So this is your decoder part of the network. So the input to the neural network is high dimension. The encoder is a part of the network that produces a lower dimension representation. And then you have a decoder part of the network, which has the same dimension as the original data. And you use that to reconstruct the original data from this lower dimensional representation. Okay. So let's think about how this works in terms of our recipe. So you get some sample. What's the output for that sample? The output for the sample will be the reconstructed sample. And the loss function here is going to be, again, the reconstruction error. So that's the distance between the original sample and the reconstructed sample. So it's essentially like the target, so the variable you're trying to produce is the original data itself. But here, the interesting thing is that we're not really interested in the reconstructed sample directly. We're really interested in the intermediate representation. Now, are we specifically training to, let's say, minimize or maximize something about that intermediate representation? Okay, so we're not doing that. We're training to, minimize reconstruction error. But when we train to minimize reconstruction error, since we're forced to, let's say, have this intermediate representation that's of smaller dimension, then we're forcing the network to learn the intermediate representation that's most effective at reconstructing the sample. So although we're not explicitly looking for any specific characteristics of the latent representation, we're asking the network to learn the latent representation that minimizes the reconstruction error. So those turn out to be kind of the most useful aspects of it. And it has the advantage over PCA that it's a nonlinear operation. Now there is one issue here. Let's do this, okay. So if we would do something like this, right, where we didn't have a bottleneck in the middle, I drew this with a bottleneck where in the middle you have a smaller number of hidden units than you had inputs or outputs. If we didn't have this, and if we had the same number of hidden units or an equal number of hidden units to the input and output dimension, then we wouldn't necessarily be forced to learn a compressed representation. Right? You could actually have a network that just learns the identity function. Right? Since we're just trying to reproduce the input exactly, a network that just learns the identity function would reproduce the input exactly, have zero training error, but it would be not at all useful. So instead, we might train an undercomplete autoencoder, so we have a bottleneck in the middle, which forces it to learn a low-dimensional representation. The problem is that forcing the network to learn a low-dimensional representation by enforcing this bottleneck here also means that the network might not be able to learn very complicated features. So we know that, let's say, the number of hidden units determines how complex the features the network can learn are. If we ultimately here only have a few hidden units, then we can't learn many complex features. Okay. Another problematic aspect of this is that, let's say, even if the bottleneck is very small, the network might not still learn the most important features. So for example, the network might just learn to, let's say, encode the index of the samples into this latent representation. So it might just, let's say, memorize all of the samples. And in this part of the encoder where it produces a latent representation, it would just produce an index. And then the decoder would essentially have a lookup table. By the way, I drew this with only, kind of one layer here, but there's actually multiple layers in the middle. Okay. So if we just did that, right, with one kind of bottleneck in the middle, this whole network could learn a mapping from, let's say, sample to sample index. Then this whole network can learn a mapping from sample index to original sample. And you could reconstruct the sample exactly, but without necessarily learning any useful features. So an alternative to, let's say, having this bottleneck enforced by the number of hidden units is to enforce a bottleneck by having a penalty on activations. So what this basically means is that we can have many hidden units here, as many as we want, but in each iteration, so for each input sample, we want to enforce that only a few of the hidden units are activated. So we're going to apply a penalty on the output of the activation function at this layer. So this enforces that, let's say, we have to learn a small representation because we can't have many of these neurons be active for any given sample. But we can still learn very complex features because different neurons can specialize. So we can have that, let's say, for one particular sample, these two neurons are active. For a different sample, maybe these two neurons are active. So this is what's known as a sparse autoencoder. So we have a penalty function on the activations. The network is now no longer able to memorize samples, but can still extract very complex features. Okay, what do you use autoencoders for? Well, what would you use any dimensionality reduction for? Okay, so anything you might use dimensionality reduction for, you can use a neural autoencoder for. And you just need to take out, let's say, this intermediate representation and use that instead of the output of the decoder. So for example, you might use this representation for visualization. You might use it for feature learning. So you might take the output of this layer and use it as input to a different supervised machine learning method. Or you might use it for dimensionality reduction for visualization. So here's an example of that. So this is a visualization of MNIST, which we know is 784 dimensional data. The visualization on the left was produced by, let's say, taking the projection onto the first two principal components and then visualizing it in 2 dimensions. And the color here refers to which digit. Now, this is an interesting visualization because notice that, let's say, the same digits tend to be kind of near each other in this projected feature space, which makes sense because we're capturing what's most important about the samples. But which representation do you think is better, representation A or representation B? They're both 2-dimensional representations. Okay, representation is B seems to be much better, right? You can see it's much more effective at detecting, let's say, what makes a 1 or what makes a 2 in 2-dimensional space. And that's because representation A is produced by PCA, which can only learn a linear projection. So it learns the best possible linear projection, but it's still limited in that it's a linear projection. Projection B is learned by a neural autoencoder. So it can learn a nonlinear mapping of input to 2-dimensional data. Similarly, here's a reconstruction of faces from a 30-dimensional latent representation. So the row on the top is the original faces. The middle row is a reconstruction from 30-dimensional data using a neural autoencoder. And the row on the bottom is a reconstruction from a 30-dimensional PCA. Which one looks better, the middle row or the bottom row? Okay, so the middle row is a much better representation of the original data in the top row. So the neural autoencoder, which can learn nonlinear mappings of data to reduce data, can sometimes learn a better representation of the data because it's not restricted to a linear projection. Okay, there's one more type of unsupervised learning I want to talk about, and that is density estimation. And I just want to talk about this because it's kind of very exciting and relevant to modern machine learning. Okay, so let's introduce a couple of ideas here, actually. So density dimension or density estimation is also a type of unsupervised learning. So we listed a few different types here. We mentioned it previously in the context of anomaly detection. So being able to detect if a new sample is not drawn from the same density as original samples. So there are a couple of types of density estimation. One type is explicit density estimation. Explicit density estimation says we explicitly find the density, so P of X of the data X. And then once we explicitly find the density function of the data, then we can do all kinds of things. So we can say if a new sample is likely to be from that density function or not, like in the anomaly detection case, or we can generate new samples from the same density function. Alternatively, we might have implicit density estimation. With implicit density estimation, we don't explicitly define the density function, but we still want to, let's say, be able to say whether a new sample is from the same function, same distribution, or we still want to, let's say, be able to generate samples from that distribution. So density estimation, two types, explicit, implicit. Now, I also want to talk about types of models. So far in our machine learning class, we've basically been talking about discriminative models. What are discriminative models? Discriminative models are models that capture some conditional probability. So the probability of observing, let's say, some particular sample label Y, given that you have some feature data X. There's another class of models called generative models, which capture the joint probability, the probability of X and Y. Or if you have unlabeled data, just capturing the probability of X. So today we're going to talk about a generative adversarial network, which is a type of neural network that is an unsupervised, generative, implicit density estimation model. And here's what it does. Given some training data, so we have some training data X, we're going to generate a new sample from same distribution. Okay, so we have some data X. Given some data X for training, we're generating a new sample from the same distribution. Now the input is not going to be the same. We're actually going to use a noise vector to generate that, but we'll get back to that in a minute. Okay, so our goal is to generate a new sample from the same distribution. Now, what kind of a loss function could we use to train this type of network? So we have, let's say, a system that's called G. It's a generator. And we're going to produce, let's say it's parameterized by theta. And we're interested in learning parameters of theta such that when we apply a transformation to some noise sample, and I mean literally it's just random noise, it will produce something that looks like it came from X. So I'm going to produce G theta of Z that looks like it came from the same distribution that X is drawn from. How do I train this network to let's say, transform Z into something that looks like it came from X, or something that looks like it came from the same distribution as X? Well, one interesting thing here is that we have actually examples of X, right? I'm going to move this out of the way. Okay, so we have some examples of X here. I'm going to use those examples of X, and I'm going to use it to train another machine learning model. Okay. So I had a generator over here. I'm going to have another model over here. Okay, and this model is a discriminator model. So model A is generator. Model B is discriminator. Okay, and we'll call it D. And let's say D is parameterized by, okay, it has its own system of parameters. All right, so what does the discriminator do? Well, the discriminator gets two types of inputs. It gets inputs of G theta Z, which come from the generator. It also gets inputs of true values X. And it knows which is which. So you could think of these as labeled inputs. this is, let's say, X. And let's say the label is 1 if it came from the true data. And the label should be 0 if it came from the generator. So the discriminator essentially has label data as input. Sorry, this label should be 0 because it came from the generator. Okay, so we have our discriminator. It gets 2 types of inputs. It gets inputs from the true distribution of X, and it gets inputs from the generator. What is it trying to learn? Well, it's trying to learn a classification of these samples as being either class 0, which is fake, or class 1 real. So we're going to learn d phi of X. And we want this to be close to 1. So this is just your plain old classification, maybe with a sigmoid output layer. So when we get an input that comes from the true sample, we want d phi of X to be close to 1. On the other hand, we want d phi of g theta v, so this is a fake sample, to be close to 0. Let's just kind of highlight what the fake samples are. Okay, so this is a fake sample. This is a fake sample. This is a fake sample. Okay, and this is the output of the number. Okay, so the discriminator produces some mapping of some random noise. Sorry, the generator produces some transformation of some random noise, mapping of the random noise, sorry. And the discriminator produces a classification that says a sample is either, let me make this yellow, true or fake. Now, how do we train this network? So now we have 2 machine learning models. One is parameterized by theta, one is parameterized by phi. This one produces a class label, so either a 0 for fake or 1 for real. And this one produces some multi-dimensional output that has the same dimension as X, that is supposed to look like it came from P of X. We want the generator to keep updating its parameters so that its samples look more and more like X. So we want it to kind of trick the discriminator. And meanwhile, we want the discriminator to keep getting better and better at distinguishing between the generator samples and the true samples, right? Because that's what makes the generator learn. Okay, so let's think about how to train this model. The typical loss function for a, let's say, classifier like this discriminator would be a binary cross entropy loss. Right? So let's define this binary cross entropy loss function. Okay, the left side refers to the loss for the true samples. Okay. So here yi is 1 for the true samples. And here the log loss is d sub phi, so d parameterized by phi, of the true sample, which is X. The right side of the loss function refers to the loss over the fake samples. So here the true yi is 0, right? And here we're looking at the output of the discriminator for, that's actually a typo. That should say g sub theta v. Let's fix that. Okay. Now we're going to replace our sums with expectations just to make it a little easier. Then we could say that the discriminator wants to maximize this loss function. Okay, so we want to maximize the log of the discriminator output over the true samples. And remember, we want this to be as close as possible to 1. And we want this to be as close as possible to 0, which means this expectation should also be as close as possible to 1. And this expectation is for all the samples over the distribution of the samples. This expectation is over the random noise that we use as input to the generator. So we want the discriminator to maximize this objective. So log of its output over the true samples plus log of 1 minus its output over the fake samples. So we can actually just use that directly. So we could say, let's do that. We're going to have the discriminator just optimize that. So in every training iteration, we'll get a sample. Okay, so get some noise as input to the generator, have the generator output a g of theta of z. Okay. Then take a sample from the true distribution, input that to the discriminator. Now, in practice, we'll actually take a batch of these. So we'll take m from the discriminator. We'll take m inputs from the we'll take m inputs from the generator and m inputs from the true data. And now we'll have, let's say, m labels for fake samples, m labels for real samples. We'll compute this loss function. Discriminator loss, which is a binary cross entropy loss. Okay, so we're going to compute this loss function. And then we'll use that for gradient ascent on the discriminator parameters. Gradient ascent because we express the loss function as something that we want the discriminator to maximize. So we want the discriminator to maximize this expression. So find the parameters phi that maximize its prediction for the true samples and 1 minus its prediction for the fake samples. Okay, so that's how we train the discriminator, right? It's kind of easy to see how to train the discriminator. It's similar to any other type of classifier we've looked at before. Okay, so we get some inputs from fake samples, we get some inputs from true samples. And this is labeled because we know which samples came from the generator and which are real. And then we have the discriminator produce a class label for each, use our standard binary cross entropy loss to compute the loss, and then do back propagation to find parameters of phi that improve the loss. How do we update the generator? So the generator wants to do the opposite of what the discriminator wants to do. The discriminator wants to maximize this, right, by finding the values of phi that maximize this. The generator wants to do the opposite. So the generator wants to find the values of theta that minimizes this expression. The generator wants its samples to look as close as possible to the true samples, right? So wants this and this to be basically identical, which means that it wants the discriminator to be unable to tell the difference between the real samples and the fake samples. So the generator wants to make the discriminator loss worse. It wants to maximize this. So after we train the discriminator for one cycle, okay, then we'll do a cycle where, okay, so the discriminator wants to maximize this over phi. The generator wants to minimize this over theta. So this is kind of the opposite form. So after we train the discriminator for a cycle, so do gradient ascent, then we'll train the generator as follows. So we'll get another batch of noise inputs, and then we'll do gradient descent over this. So we had, let's say, binary cross entropy loss. Let's say, okay, so the loss over the true samples plus loss over the fake samples. Now, the generator doesn't have any control or doesn't really care about the loss over the true samples. The loss over the true samples, which is this part here, doesn't include the generator parameters theta, right? So the loss over the true samples is not relevant to the generator, but the loss over the fake samples is relevant to the generator. The generator wants to minimize this expression here. Right? So the generator's loss function is this expression. So let's say generator loss. It wants to minimize discriminator, or let's say, I'm going to say maximize, okay, no, minimize discriminator performance on fake samples. Okay, so it wants to minimize this expression, log 1 minus d, okay, theta, sorry, c. And remember that theta is what the generator controls. So we can train the generator using the discriminator network. So, okay, so here's how it works. Okay, we take a noise sample, give it to the generator, have the generator produce some transformation of the noise sample using theta, feed that to the discriminator, also feed true data samples to the discriminator, have it produce class samples for class labels as output, okay, so 0, 1 labels, compute the binary cross entropy loss function, so find the loss over the true samples plus the loss over the fake samples, and then do some gradient ascent on phi to move in the direction of steepest ascent, right? Because the discriminator wants to maximize this. So it moves in the direction of the gradient of this function. All right, we've just updated the parameters phi. So now it's time to update theta. How do we update theta? Well, we take another noise sample, so a new noise sample Z. We have the generator produce it, produce some transformation G theta V. Then we feed it to the discriminator. And I'm going to put this here. Okay. So the discriminator produces this as output. Move this up for a second. Okay, so when we're training the discriminator loss function includes the discriminator decision on the true samples and the discriminator's decision on the fake samples. And the discriminator loss is then used for gradient ascent on phi. When we're training the generator, okay, we take the generator loss as the discriminator performance on just a fake sample. And then we use the gradient of that loss function to do gradient descent on theta. And so every time we do that, the generator gets slightly better at producing samples that kind of trick the discriminator. So we go back and forth where we train the two together. So first you generate a set of fake samples, true samples. You update the discriminator parameters so it gets better at distinguishing between true and fake samples. Then you generate a new set of fake samples and you use the output of the discriminator to compute the loss over the fake samples. And then you use that to update theta, which are the parameters of the generator, to make the generator better at producing samples that fool the discriminator. And then you go back and you train the discriminator again. And you keep repeating this procedure so that the discriminator gets better and better at distinguishing between true and fake samples. And at the same time, the generator is getting better and better at fooling the discriminator. Now, there's a slight problem with this loss function. So this loss function actually does badly when the discriminator is doing well. What do I mean by it does badly? So when the discriminator is doing well, this gradient tends towards 0 or tends towards being flat. Now, we actually want the generator to improve a lot when the discriminator is doing well. So we want big gradients to help the generator improve when the discriminator is doing well. So we actually trained the generator on a slightly different loss function. So we're going to train the generator to maximize a slightly different loss function. Okay, let's train the generator to maximize log of d g theta d. Yeah, okay. So we're going to train the generator to basically maximize this, which says make the discriminator think the generator samples are as close to 1 as possible. Okay, so this maximizes the likelihood of discriminator being wrong. And this is just helpful for training. All right, we're going to look at an example of this. And you can play around with this at home. Okay, so imagine this here is a true distribution of the data. Okay, so this set of green samples. And we're going to try and train the generator to produce samples that look like they came from this distribution. And we're going to use this discriminator to train the generator. Okay, so we're going to try and see how it works. All right, so this is a generator. It's a transformation of the noise input to this, let's say, new space. Okay, so the generator is learning this transformation. This is what the neural network in the generator learns. Okay. So we have noise samples. They're used as input to the generator. Then we produce some samples. Okay. And the discriminator will classify those samples as being fake or real. So the output of the generator is fed to the discriminator. So is a set of real samples. And the discriminator decides whether they're real or fake. Okay. Here you can see the green and purple background here shows whether the discriminator thinks points in a particular sample are real or fake. You can see in this region, for example, there is only real samples and there are no generator samples. So the discriminator is pretty sure that samples in this region must be real. But over here, for example, there are only fake samples. So the discriminator believes that samples over here must be fake. Okay. So then we compute the generator loss, the discriminator loss, and we can use the gradients to update the discriminator. So in each iteration, the discriminator will update its, let's say, classification. So now you can see these regions have slightly changed. The next step is going to be to train the generator. Okay, so the generator gets samples from noise. We messed this up. Let's do this again. Okay. So now we generate some new samples from the noise. And now we're using only this bottom part of the network. So we're not using the top part up here. So we're getting some samples from noise. The discriminator is going to classify those. And we use that to compute the generator loss. Okay, so the generator wants the discriminator output to be as large as possible for its fake samples. And we'll use that to update the gradients of the generator, or update the generator parameters based on the gradients. So now these lines on each point show the gradients, meaning these samples need to move in the direction of the gradients in order to fool the discriminator. Okay, so we can see on each iteration, the discriminator will update its transformation. That's what you see here, and generate points that are more and more like the true distribution. Meanwhile, in each iteration, the discriminator is going to try and do better and better at classifying whether samples belong to the true distribution or the fake one. All right, well, it's 11 o'clock, so we're going to stop there. So this is our entire discussion of unsupervised learning. Are there any questions? All right, I'll see you all.